Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's really a pleasure to be here and to talk about partnerships from the perspective of the private sector. As Paul said, I'm working for MSD in the Netherlands, and I think the private sector is absolutely crucial in these partnerships, and I hope to give you a couple of examples of these partnerships that we currently are embarking upon within Merck. And I'll talk a little bit about the euSEND project that we work together with many other universities and companies about temperature stable oxytocin. And finally, also I'd like to say a couple of things about an exciting new program that Merck has embarked upon, which is called Merck or MSD for Mothers, which has to do with the maternal mortality. So drugs for developing countries, I think we all agree that that's very much needed. And this is the Access to Medicine Index in 2010. I'm sure that many of you have seen it before. It gives you a nice overview of what the private sector, what pharmaceutical companies nowadays are doing in order to improve access to medicines. And you can see the list of the names of the companies over here, and you can see that some of them do not a lot and others do quite a lot. But I think the conclusion is that we still don't do enough, because we still need more drugs for developing countries, for resource-poor countries, because still there is an enormous need for these medicines. Now Merck luckily is not doing too bad, but again it can always be better. And I'd just like to give you a couple of examples of the projects in which we are currently involved. We are involved with a collaboration with the Wellcome Trust, and perhaps Ted Bianco will tell a little bit more about that later today. I will tell you a little bit about what we're doing for family planning services, which we're all doing for a very long time, which all originated from the Organon time, the Dutch pharmaceutical company in the southern parts of the Netherlands and Os, which has been taken over by Schering-Plough and now by MSD, but we're still very active in the field of family planning. We're working in China to reform the healthcare situation. The river blindness program is a very important one. And finally, also we are working to bring our treatments for HIV/AIDS to patients in some of the countries. So let's talk first a bit about family planning. And this is a slide which shows you the contraceptive prevalence rate. So how many people, women, couples are actually using contraceptives, modern contraceptives. And you can see that in the most dark areas, the actual prevalence of that use of contraceptives is very low, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia. Still a lot needs to be done there in order to have people have more use of modern contraceptives. And although we're doing better over the years, so there are more users of modern contraception, nevertheless, with increasing population, you also see that the demand for contraception is increasing. And therefore, there is a large unmet need for adequate family planning services. And that is important because the effects of access to family planning can be quite dramatic in a positive sense. This is coming from a slide I got from the internet from USAID, which shows you what happens if you prevent pregnancies with the maternal death incidence. And if you just look at this 15-year period, by reducing the number of pregnancies, the number of maternal deaths can in fact decrease quite significantly. And you see all the statistics here, and the numbers are quite impressive, as all the statistics are quite impressive, which have to do with maternal mortality or any other disease in low-resource countries. So why is family planning so important there? A couple of other statistics. 65 million unplanned pregnancies per year. Every minute one woman dies from complications of pregnancy. It's of course this occurring primarily in developing countries. Lots of problems with the children, high infant mortality. In countries where women do well, children do well. And clearly, unmet need for contraception is high, and the access and the acceptance of contraception is a major challenge that we need to address. So, in fact, and this is still coming from our Organon institutional family planning business, we have quite a lot of institutional activities going on. You can see on this slide the areas where, for example, we are working with Implanon, which is the single rod ethanogesteral implant, which gives you a protection for 3 years against unwanted pregnancy, which is highly effective and particularly, I think, worldwide in these areas. It protects you for 3 years, and so people and women don't have to come back to have new contraceptives. So 3-year protection. And actually, it's doing pretty well. We have lots of governmental activities, collaborations going on there to make these contraceptives more available. And this is just a slide which just describes a couple of these coalitions we have and lots of these partnerships. This whole meeting is about partnerships, the importance of partnerships. These are a couple of them which are related to women's health, and you can see all the names and all the partnerships that we currently have. And these are important because they give us access to a lot of knowledge that we do not have. And for the other partners, it's important because they have entrance to what we know, and that is obviously a win-win situation. Just a couple of things on some of the other projects we are working on. An important one, a well-known one, is the Mactison program, which is the medicine which can actually cure and prevent river blindness. And that Merck has been already working for that for 25 years. And these tablets are basically given away to the areas and the countries where this disease is prevalent. And it has really led to at least 40,000 cases of blindness that have been prevented, etc. So the statistics here are also quite impressive in this Mactison donation program. We also involved in HIV partnerships together with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and together with the government of Botswana, where we also make available HIV medications to large parts of that society. And also want to mention here the Rotatec program in Nicaragua, where the rotavirus vaccine is made available to virtually all children who need it in that particular country. And that has led to more than 1.3 million doses of Rotatex in that country. And therefore, it's the highest rate of the rotavirus vaccination in the world. Now, these are a couple of donation programs. Now, I'd spend a couple of words on the Hot Medicines project, which is a project together with TI Pharma and euSEND, very relevant, therefore, for our meeting today. It's a very nice word, Hot Medicines partnership, and it relates to the need for heat-stable medicines in tropical countries. And I'm sure you'll agree there is a need for that, particularly for those products which are needed to be refrigerated, which have to be transported in a cold chain. And you can imagine that that has many disadvantages in tropical areas. Because once it's getting out of that cold chain, you will lose active ingredients. There will be more degradation products in these medicines. And that might, at the end, result in less reliable results. So there were two approaches, dry formulations and liquid formulations. So a dry formulation meaning going for a freeze-dried approach, but you still need sterile water to reconstitute, and then it can be injected and administered. Liquid formulations, there you have it, ready-to-use liquids, and that, of course, has the advantage of leading less activities to administer it, and that might be particularly helpful in areas where, community level, for example, where the possibilities for trained birth attendants are less clear. So, this was about polypeptide-based priority medicines, cold chain requirements to break it. The budget in total was about 1.6 million euros, and there was a large consortium here in the Netherlands working on it. 3 industrial partners, 2 academic partners, and the top institute Pharma. And here we were very much working on 3 different compounds: oxytocin, insulin, and hemagglutinin. I think in reality, most of the efforts was really done on oxytocin, and I'll give you some data on that. So yeah, the partnerships made a lot of sense because you could combine expertise from various sources into one effort. And of course, the companies were leaders in therapeutic drug and vaccine development, but some of the universities and others are leaders in dry drug chemistry and others in liquid drug chemistry. So combining that expertise together should be a guarantee for success. Now, just a couple of words on oxytocin. This is really a very important hormone for the treatment and the prevention of postpartum hemorrhage. Postpartum hemorrhage being the most important cause of death, maternal mortality. So oxytocin should be made available much more than currently is happening, and that's the reason why that's not happening is because it has to be transported in a cold chain. It has to be kept in a refrigerator. Currently there are two formulations available. It's a fully liquid formulation in vials, or it's actually one available. It's liquid in vials, and you have to give that intramuscularly or intravenously. They're highly unstable, as I said, and therefore in rural and remote areas there is insufficient access to oxytocin because of the lack of a cold chain. Not only were we involved with the Hot Medicines project in the framework of euSEND and TI Pharma, but also in the Meshworks we were involved with another large collaboration, many organizations involved there, also very much focusing on bringing a temperature stable oxytocin to patients. Just a couple of data. These are the data from the liquid formulations. So these are a couple of batches that we prepared, and it took a lot of time to actually figure out which batches and which pharmaceutical formulations were to be used to have a little bit of chance of success. But if you then look at the most successfully promising ones, then still it is quite difficult to come up with a stable solution. You can see here the number of degradation, the percentage of degradation products. It should be below these lines, and these are the 3 months stability data. And you can see that already after 3 months there is already quite a lot of degradation. And if you then extrapolate that at 30 degrees centigrade for 2 or 3 years, you can see that, well, about 1/3 of this particular batch, 1/3 of the oxytocin is not stable anymore, and there are degradation products. So that's not good enough. Also applicable for the other liquid formulation. We did the same thing with a number of formulations for the freeze-dried formulation, which was a bit more successful. Not this particular batch, but you can see over here that after 3 months, the batches that were tested over here were actually pretty good. 3 months below these lines of 5% and 10% of degradation products. And if you extrapolate that for 3 years, only 3.2%. So that is really a very stable formulation as it looks like. The 2 to 3 years of storage at 30 degrees centigrade, which is the WHO recommendation for a temperature stable oxytocin, can actually easily be reached with this particular batch. So that's good. So that's a successful outcome, no doubt about that. On the other hand, it's not making things very easy, because now we have a liquid which can be injected relatively easy, we would say, from our perspective. But if you're coming with a freeze-dried product, you always, as I said earlier, are facing the fact that you have to use the vial and reconstitute it with sterile water. So you need 2 vials, and it needs to be reconstituted. You need lots of needles. There's a lot of hassle around that. And you can imagine that at community level, this is not going to work at all. Of course, there are all sorts of sophisticated technologies available which might be helpful to prevent this mixture of sterile water and freeze-dried products, and all sorts of nice dual chamber injectors where you in fact can inject right away, and by pressing here the plunger, you mix together the freeze-dried powder and the water for injection, and can do the injection right away. So it can be done at an easier way, but you can understand as well that of course will dramatically increase the costs of those oxytocin preparations, and that is probably the major hurdle to use these type of devices. So yeah, it's easier, it's more difficult to do it like this, it's easier like that, but at the cost of higher costs of manufacturing. Now, another thing which might be interesting, and I saw that already in the previous slide here, this is the Uniject device, which is an interesting one, which might be helpful in bringing the current formulation of oxytocin, the liquid one, which is not temperature stable, which might be helpful to bring that to communities. And the Uniject is a very interesting and nice device. It was actually developed by Path in Seattle, but perhaps we'll hear a little bit more about it in the next presentation by Michael Free. It was developed by Path, and Becton and Dickinson is now actually commercializing it. And it's a single dose, it's pre-filled and sterile and non-reusable. If you just look at it in a little bit more detail, it's a very straightforward, easy device with the cap, with the needle, with a hub, with a valve which prevents it from going back, and hit a blister, and you just simply prime it once you take out the cap and you inject it intramuscularly and you press on the blister, and there you are. It's really very, very simple. A little bit of training perhaps needed. And using this device for ordinary oxytocin might be, in fact, be very helpful to bring it to some communities where it's not available right now. So we're thinking about perhaps looking at this in a bit more depth to see whether we can help out here to commercialize this a bit further. So conclusions about temperature stable oxytocin is that the stability for 2 to 3 years with the dry formulation seems to be possible. Please remember that it still takes a lot of time to get it on the market because the regulatory pathways are slow, as you know. So it needs more stability testing, it needs some analysis tests, and then you would be able to get it on the market by 2015. Unfortunately, a liquid formulation is a bit more complex. We have not been able yet to make that. And as I said earlier, the advantages of temperature stability needs to be balanced against the costs and the complexity of administration. Regulatory hurdles, I think, is something really that lots of people underestimate. This is really very important that we, with any new product, whether it's a change in packaging or whatever, that it goes through the regulatory approval process, and that we do not use dual standards approaches here, that we say, well, it might not be good enough for the Western societies, but it's good enough for low-income countries. That's something that a pharmaceutical company definitely cannot get involved with. So we need to have one standard for all. And the other thing where we're looking at right now is they're looking at alternative administration methods. What I mentioned already, the Uniject. Perhaps it would be even fantastic if you could come up with a dual chamber Uniject, where you can actually use the freeze-dried temperature stable in a Uniject system, and that would make things even more easy and better for to get it introduced. Intranasal is still worthwhile looking at, and there actually is a group in Monash in Australia who's looking at pulmonary, so inhalation administration of oxytocin. So in other words, a very nice collaboration, very nice partnership, a euSEND and a Top Institute Pharma partnership, which was successful in the sense that we did come up with a freeze-dried formulation which is temperature stable, but which still requires some discussion as to how to further work on it and make it available for patients. So finally, I'd like to just give you a couple of slides of information about a recent activity that Merck has involved with and for which partnerships are also essential. It's just called Merck for Mothers, or here in Europe, MSD for Mothers. And this really has to do with MDG 5, so bringing back maternal mortality by 3/4 by 2015. And in this slide, you see the causes of maternal mortality. It is primarily postpartum hemorrhage, it's eclampsia, preeclampsia, and these two account for more than 50% of the maternal mortalities. So this is really a terrible statistic if you then realize that the coming 10 years, something like 3 million women will die of complications of pregnancy and childbirth. Another statistic I recently read was that every woman in low-resource countries through her life has a chance of 1 out of 6 to die from giving birth. And that's just completely unacceptable, of course. MSD for Mothers is basically a 10-year, $500 million commitment. It's a lot of money. It's just somebody say, we don't have any money to bring here. Well, we do. and it's a lot of money, 500 million. And we've become suddenly quite popular the last couple of months since we were talking about this, because everybody wants to have his share, rightfully so. And we're still figuring out exactly at this moment how to spend this in the right way. So if you have any brilliant ideas, don't hesitate to contact me and come up with your ideas and see where we can perhaps collaborate on this. So this is a 10-year commitment for $500 million. And we, in fact, will concentrate on 3 pillars. First, it's a product innovation. So we would like to develop game-changing technologies for maternal health in resource-poor settings. And we concentrate on 3 areas. It's family planning, it will be preeclampsia, and it will be postpartum hemorrhage. And I'm happy to say that we'll very closely collaborate together with Path in Seattle to research those technologies and to make those choices of which technologies that we really want to go forward with. Secondly, another important pillar is access, and perhaps maternal mortality is not a technology problem, but is rather a problem which has to do with access to what's already out there. And also here we want to advance programs that expand access to maternal health solutions and products. And finally, it's also very important to interact with authorities and other policymakers to make them aware of what's going on and try to influence also here the implementation of life-saving technologies. So, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, the access to medicines and corporate social responsibility in general are increasingly important for pharmaceutical companies. You've seen that list that I showed you in the first slide. I'm sure that there will be more public attention to these type of lists, and rightfully so, because it will force companies in the private sector to think about what they are doing, and they should do more than just making medicines for the Western world. They should also give it to the rest of the world. And I think that is certainly something which is now being realized by the sector. Now, it is also important to have those partnerships with the private sector. We should not do it in isolation. The private sector can be pretty instrumental here. For example, of course, in financial support, no doubt about that, but also because there is unique knowledge within the private companies about the supply chain, about distribution channels, and that can be very helpful in making sure that particular medicines actually reach the patients who need it. Companies definitely have business acumen. They know how to run a business, and that is particularly important because all these solutions that we want to implement need to be sustainable. It's not a good idea to donate a lot of money, which is good, but if the money is gone, and then we return to the situation before you start donating, obviously that's not the most desired situation. It needs to be a sustainable solution, and somehow the local companies or local manufacturers or whatever needs to pick up whatever sort of solution is being proposed in order to make it sustainable. As I said, we will spend $500 million in the next 10 years for maternal mortality. We will focus on family planning, on preeclampsia and postpartum hemorrhage. Temperature stable oxytocin definitely fits into that remit, and we're looking currently at how to do that in the most efficient way. And finally, these partnerships we're talking about today, these are extremely important with NGOs, with WHO, with governments, with professional organizations, because we all need to be working together in order to get this done. Thank you very much for your attention.
Critical question, but if I remember well, a few years ago in the Lancet there was a study on the use of milaprostol, which is an oral drug and is heat stable and could also prevent hemorrhage in women. Why isn't that used in fact for?
Well, in fact, there was a meeting at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs just a couple of weeks ago where the use of uterotonics generally was discussed, and misoprostol definitely has also its place in the armamentarium that's available. I think there is no doubt about that. There are advantages and disadvantages of both the oxytocin and the misoprostol, but in some communities misoprostol might be the preferred choice, and other communities it might be oxytocin. So it's definitely not one or the other, it's both depending on the situation. But I agree, it's certainly something that should not be forgotten.
Any other questions, please? Yes.
Hi, my name is Henk Marcus. Sorry. I have a question. In the beginning, you showed some slides about donation programs. Can you explain the rationale? Because at the end, you also talk about sustainability. So can you explain why Merck chooses to have those as donation programs and not necessarily, for example, as differentiating pricing or those kind of? Yeah. What is the?
It's a good question. I don't have all the answers exactly on the details of those donation programs, but I think certainly in the MSD for Mothers project, there is clearly the intention to do this in a sustainable way, and I fully agree that just donating, of course, will help. As you see now, I mean, a number of cases of river blindness that have been prevented and cured are enormous, so it's good. But it's even better to do this in a sustainable way. And that's certainly the intention for the Merck for Mothers project.
Yes, please.
Thank you. At one point you referred
please,
to...
Can you
Ted Bianco, the Wellcome Trust. At one point you talked about the importance of there being one standard, one product across territories, developed and developing economies. So, I mean, I'd just like to sort of press you on that a bit and try and understand it better. There was famously the withdrawal of Rota Shield, which was a vaccine for which interception turned out to be an issue. And that decision was taken by Wyeth, and they needed to decide on their company position. But the consequence was a vaccine that was pretty effective for rotaviral diarrhea, which kills hundreds of thousands of children in some parts of the world, was taken off the market for many years, and thank goodness there are new rotavirus vaccines. So my question really is, what is the consequence of electing that there should be one standard for all? I've been deeply entrenched in India recently, trying to understand India and its potential advantages, and the Jaipur foot is another remarkable example. A prosthesis made out of local materials using local skills, which is actually extremely good, is not made of titanium, as you would expect if you were getting one from MIT or Mass General Hospital. So, what it really comes down to is what is the responsible way for companies? And I think companies like Merck, the big international companies, perhaps are in the hardest place over this. But I do think it's an important debate.
Yeah, I agree, and I think I'm speaking from a manufacturer perspective, and then I think it's unavoidable that whatever you come up with, it's something new or something that you support, that you should do that in such a way that it at least supports the specification criteria of the product that you're providing. Yeah, so for example, in oxytocin, actually Dr. Hogenzel did research many years ago, showing that for oxytocin after 1 year, 15% only of the active ingredient seems to be unstable. Yet it is more than, it's not allowed according to the specifications. So you can't, as a manufacturer, actually propagate using oxytocin after that year because it's not out, because it's out of specs. So that's, I think, from a clinician's perspective, you're probably much easier to say these sort of things, and obviously they should say that. Only from a manufacturer's perspective, you only can come up with something which has the same quality wherever you use it in the world. Otherwise, you're getting into complex discussions. So that's probably something which far more at the medical community needs to be discussed. But the manufacturer's perspective here is, I think, is unavoidable that you have to come up with one standard.
Okay, thank you, Trevor Jones.
Trevor Jones, just to expand on that a bit. Of course, this dilemma that you mentioned, Ted, over rotavirus was adopting a single regulatory standard, good for America and good for the developing world. And part of that resulted in the issue for the European Union, at least, the EMA, of saying, well, we won't necessarily just approve something for children or adults in the EU. We'll create a review process which is robust, and then we'll advise the developing world regulatory agencies or whoever what we feel about the standards that have been achieved. And it will be up to the developing world authorities to make the risk-benefit decision in a rather different manner than if it was necessarily America or the EU. Secondly, and very importantly, as we'll hear later today, the WHO role can be central in this, in pre-qualification. Whatever the standards that we must adhere to for America, for Europe, for Japan, for China, and so on, at least the WHO has been consistent in saying it will pre-qualify, and their judgment can be used in the developing world. So it is difficult because the industry is always attacked for dual standards if we get it wrong. You mean you didn't care about these children in Africa? Would you let it happen in Boston and Birmingham and so on? But I do think these are techniques that allow local risk-benefit decisions in a different basis.